I thought that I would ask the first question, and I would ask that of Benjamin. Your building is a very powerful architectural statement, confident, inclusive, very powerful, and full of subtle initiatives. So in Mexico City, how is that regarded by the civic fathers in the community? Did they get it?
Hello. Yes. Well, I think this is a very interesting question, and that's something that has happened to me many times in my year life as an architect. When we start pouring the concrete, the majority of the society starts reclaiming that it was going to be a very solid facade towards Paseo de la Reforma, and we receive a lot of arguing about that. With the time, and when they understood this idea of monolithic building or volume, they all now love it very much. In fact, we have received through the website many very nice comments from the city about the beauty of this element that is in the city. And it's certainly, you can see from all over. But yes, at the beginning, it's shocking. The same, we did once a building that is made out of 2 steel walls, all of it, only 2 steel walls. And at the beginning, they were wondering if it was a thermal plant in a very high residential area or something like that. And now the building took its position, and the people accept it very well.
Fantastic. I think as architects, we all go through the planning process with authorities, and it's often very difficult to have them understand the vision from just 2-dimensional images usually.
Just for you to imagine, when we went to the Art Institute to say that we wanted to displace the house, they were convinced that we were going to destroy it, and we were going to say, oops, it fell down. and it was tough. Even I remember I proposed them to give a bond, a financial bond to guarantee that it was not going to happen. But fortunately, they trust us, and we could manage to do that.
And was there an element of risk in their eyes about allowing this building to go forward? Did they think it was going to be too big, too stark, all of those things?
No, they were concerned about the house. Yeah. And in terms of the zoning authorities, they were more concerned of other issues like transportation and like cars and things like that. So what they are doing in Mexico, they are requesting from the developers to help the city to improve the urban transportation, which I think is good. They were more concerned on that issue.
So has this building led to an awareness with the city fathers that great things can happen if they just give it a little bit of risk?
Yes. Well, the risk is for the investors. Because you can do a building and it can be good or bad, but if the building becomes empty, that is a risk. And I think that the great building is the one that is rented and is producing money to the investors. And I think that we comply that successfully.
Okay, wonderful.
Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, let's go to audience. James,
Carl,
let's start.
Thank you all for your terrific presentations, including yours, Carl. I'm James Perrick from the City of Toronto Planning Department and also the chair of the Urban Habitat and Urban Design Committee. A question for both Dr. Cheong, Koon, Han, and also for Ellen. You both touched upon this issue of livability and quality of life from the dwelling unit. And I'm just wondering if you can elaborate more upon the ingredients you look to. Are there guidelines in terms of separation distance or access to sunlight and views that you can share?
I think one of the challenges is in a very high density city. How do you get livability? It's really a combination of multi-layers of, I think, policy, planning, urban design, and actual design of typologies. So I give an example of the public housing towns. The density of the public housing town, when I fully complete each town, is about 30,000 persons per square kilometer. That's a lot of people in a town. So the structuring, it becomes very important in terms of planning. The first stage is really urban planning, getting it right in terms of the land users, working with the transport planners, making sure that infrastructure is available. You know, you just don't create high-density cities through design. High-density cities work only if the infrastructure works. You must have good infrastructure supporting a high-density city, and then you have this layering of greenery. In the case of the public housing town, we have this idea called, over the years, of course it's morphed and changed, but the basic principles are the same, is about the idea of a checkerboard system. It's a little bit like what Ellen sort of did. You have the high juxtaposed with the low, and I think that gives a lot of relief. And for us, we bring in a lot of greenery into the city, into the town. Setbacks is a little bit different in Singapore compared to temperate climates. We actually don't like the sun very much. We don't mind buildings a little closer, and you like to be in the shade. That's quite the opposite for you. So it's less of a constraint, but you do need certain setbacks to make it work. So there is planning, there is urban design, juxtaposing your building forms, but there is also building typology. Choosing the right type of typology, in my case, for a lot of housing design and for mixed users. It is very much about community. I think in a high-density city, how do you create communities rather than having people all locked up in their own flats? So that comes down to great architecture, good public spaces, and spaces within the typology itself. We call them, it could be community living rooms, for example. So I think these are some of the ideas that we adopt. I'm just going to pass that over.
Yeah, maybe I will also add to a different scale, since the project I talk about is more of a little community. I think the issues of distances and all that in China, especially for housing, there is definitely, China has a rule that every single one of the housing unit need to have, in our case, in the urban area, 1 continuous hour of sunlight every 365 days of year. So there is definitely that kind of requirement, but that also led to a lot of kind of undesirable repetition and different kind of urban form. So I think some of the things, the 2 things that I think are most important is how do we design it for human scale, not just machine and producing all the density. And the other one is really how do we introduce the idea of variety and diversity. So in the project I talk about, we spend a lot of time trying to create variety and heights. Dr. Cheong talked about mix of high-rise and low-rise. And then how do you use the building spacing at different heights to reduce the perceived density and allow more sunlight and wind breeze through the project? And also bring the idea that we are just not designing for the unit itself, but designing for the public realm, because you just cannot air condition and cool or warm the outdoor space. So how do you take all that in consideration? And then, so that's more kind of variety. But human scale is also very important, which is actually a very large challenge in China, because besides the gated community, the idea that I talk about, which it makes it very hard to go from one neighborhood to the other or get access to the waterfront or the transit station, but really creating a smaller blocks, but also introducing smaller buildings and pay a lot of attention to each one of the active paths that they either has active, vibrant users on the ground floor or they have attractive open spaces. I think another thing in China is, you know, in terms of open space design, very often the thing is, I have the largest open space. I have a 6-hectare open space in my community. But what does that do to each one of the residents or people walking there, working there? So it's how do we create different size open spaces that will serve different community at the ground level, which I think are very critical in creating successful community.
Thank you, Alan. Yeah, I think that we can definitely over-regulate. And this is in the quest to make the world a perfect place. And we're certainly going through this in Melbourne at the moment, where we've had a change of government after a government that promoted a lot of development. Development, which I might say has really added to the vibrance and the character of our city. So I think, and I think our government, I hope, is starting to get the message that we should be providing more flexible guidelines which facilitate excellence in environment for both, residentials and public arenas. But there is a great desire sometimes for putting down regulations, and we've solved the problem. I don't think it works. So, yes, a speaker up here, please. If you could state your name and your affiliation for the benefit of the audience, that would be great. Thanks.
Sure. Matthew Herman with Bureau Happold Engineering. This is a question that follows much along the lines of your comment there. I wanted to direct it towards Dr. Hoon. I've been fortunate enough to visit Singapore and also participate in the Punggol Master Plan. I wanted to get your thoughts on the role of policy and governance as it relates to transforming the urban habitat over a 30-year period.
Thank you. That's a very big question. I think policies, in the case of Singapore, really there are two aspects, right? One is policy. For us, in trying to get, how do you get 94% of the people owning their own home? That's policy. The way in which we work on how do you give grants and subsidies to help people to be able to pay their mortgage, how do you subsidize in order to own their own homes? Who actually gets the homes? How do you incentivize people whereby you want families to live together? We give additional incentives for families to live close by within the town. I think a lot of that is policy. The other side of it is more the physical development and the planning, the governance, the regulations. I'd just like to respond to what Carl said.
Please.
I was in Sydney last year in a conversation like this, and it was very interesting because they put the planners and the architects together. And I'm an architect planner. I sit on both sides of the table. And I said that, the planner is your friend. I know you find it very hard to believe, but we are your friends. This is a very silent audience, so probably you don't believe me. I do believe that the planners are actually setting the stage. They should facilitate. They're not purely regulators. They're there to facilitate development. And you can put in good governance to have that public-private partnership. When I was the CEO of the Urban Redevelopment Authority, I worked a lot with the developers and the architects. We have regulations. I call them guidelines because you need to put a skeleton of sorts, a framework in place for multiple architects and developers to work together and fit into the city nicely. And you need to have a framework. But planners need to also be flexible because if somebody has a great idea, and it doesn't have to be the same idea all the time, we should be very open to some of these ideas and then change the regulations, change the guidelines to facilitate development. And very often, I would just say that you saw a building there by Moshe Safdie. He has this sky garden. And we work very often with the planner, with the architect to convince the developer to keep to the purity of some of the ideas, because developers do change their mind halfway when the price and the cost of the building go up. And we do work together very closely with the architects to explain to the developer why they should keep some of these ideas that they had at the beginning. So I'll just stop there. So it's really policy, guidelines, a good design, and the partnership that is very important to, I think, make a city very successful.
Can
Thank
I
you,
add
Dr.
to
Cheong.
some of that? San Francisco being one of the first, being the first city to do all these urban design guidelines in the 80s, we have experience that I think the purpose of guidelines, I don't know about the case in Sydney, but it's really to orchestrate buildings to work together and create a desirable public realm. And then the guidelines should remain there and not to tell the developers how they do their development. It's really how their development, or doesn't matter, it's a private public sector development, but contribute to creating a collective desirable public realm.
I think the key lies in the word guidelines, not rules and regulations. Yes, thank you.
Hello, my name is Habib Ansari, and I'm a fourth-year architecture student here at IIT. And my question is for Dr. Han. What effects of climate change do you anticipate in the city of Singapore? And as an urban planner, what do you and your department plan to do about that as far as guidelines are concerned, and meeting the needs of not just the people but the environmental changes that you anticipate?
Thank you for the question. Yes, we are a city-state and we're an island, so we're under threat. I think all island states are under threat from climate change. At the very macro level, we have actually been looking into this issue. I think the first issue is really to predict how high will the sea level rise, because I don't think there is a very definitive answer. People give you all sorts of different answers. So we have done some climate change studies, and we're looking at resilience measures to try and deal with it. One, of course, very basic, is how much is the sea level going to rise? And from there, it's going to affect many, many things that we're going to do, particularly the level, the platform level of the land as a very basic first step. In the case of Singapore, it's a little unusual because we needed to convert almost every inland water body into a freshwater reservoir when I shared about the issue of water. And because of that, we literally will be cutting ourselves almost off from the sea, because you put in a lot of barrages and weirs. So that really helps to control the water level. The one I showed you as the Marina Barrage, when I was an urban planner in the URA, one of the things I worried about was the flooding of the old districts of, say, Chinatown, because it was much lower level. But because we put in the barrage, we were able to maintain the stability of the water, and I think that partly saved a big part of the city. So at the very macro level, a lot of studies about how high the sea will rise, and it affects the reclamation platform level. You notice there's a lot of reclamation work in Singapore. So the platform levels keep going higher and higher, but from a design point of view, it's very problematic because we have to match the higher platform levels back into an existing city that is a little lower. So a lot of issues, but we're trying to manage that. Second thing is about really, it's a lot to do with energy, isn't it? It's about sustainability. It's about water, energy, waste management. So the sustainability blueprint really looks into many of these areas. We are trying very hard. We have a similar rating system like the LEED, except we call it the green mark. And we have set key targets for how many of the buildings will actually get the green mark over time. Getting the green mark as a new building or the LEED is really not that difficult. Sorry, I know it's difficult, but it's not that difficult. One of the greatest problems is your existing stock of buildings. You have a couple of million of buildings. How do you get them green marked and to reduce energy? So I think those is where the policies come in. We have to incentivize people to upgrade the buildings. So energy is one major factor because we import everything. Next is the management of waste. You might think in a very big country, maybe you have less problem. For us, we don't have many landfill sites. So trying to ensure that you can close the waste loop is our next challenge. Reduce, reuse, and recycle. The water loop, we think we can close. The waste loop, we're not quite there yet. We're working very hard on recycling. So I think these are just some of the bigger picture and some of the things that we are looking at. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Cheong. Look, I think we've got time for one more question, and I'm hoping that it's going to be directed at Pete Rose. he's got to earn his keep, and what an opportunity to look into the mind of the COOP HIMMELB office. So, do we have a question for Pete? Yes.
This is a question. This is Dennis Poon from Thornton Thomas Eddy Engineers. I was in Singapore many times and had projects there. I'm so impressed. This is a question towards Dr. Cheong. We are all impressed by the public housing project in Singapore. However, many cities are trying to pull it off, including Hong Kong and many vertical cities in China. I think the basic problem is the cost. When you build public housing, how do you make the financial and works for different category of residents? When you're in Singapore, you find that there are a lot of middle-class people already, and even higher income people. So you are able to build this higher quality public housing and finance them. But at the beginning, going back to, let's say, 30 years ago, Singapore is dealing with different income level. And how do you pull it off? So maybe other cities can learn from you this financial planning for public housing and tie into infrastructure. Because without financial working properly, no policy will work.
I'm so sorry, I have to take a little bit of time to explain, but I know that you're limited in time. But we can talk later if you like. Just to explain, I think public housing in Singapore, we cannot look at public housing as just public housing, especially when you look at it financially. The government had decided many, many years ago that it is committed to affordable housing. So it is subsidized, and we do spend money. So public housing on its own cannot be seen as closed on its own. It is seen as part of fiscal expenditure for the whole of government. And the government must be prepared to put in money to subsidize. Every year I lose about $1 to $2 billion, and that is subsidized by the government. So to make it affordable, you do need to subsidize, right? But having said that, that amount of money makes up less than maybe 3% of our budget, which is pretty good to spend 2-3% and be able to house 82% of the population. So that's one part of the equation. The other part of the equation is you still have to pay for the public housing, right? Even though we subsidize it quite heavily. Then the question is, how do we get people to pay for the housing? So we use a mechanism called the Central Provident Fund, like a pension fund. So everybody in Singapore, every month I pay 20% of my income into this CPF, Central Provident Fund, and it's under my name. It's like a bank account. It is not commingled with everybody else. And my employer pays 17% of my income into the fund. So it means that every Singaporean has a savings rate of 37%. Out of this 37%, a part is locked up, you can't use it till you retire. A part of it goes to healthcare, which means every Singaporean is covered by health insurance. And 23% can be used for housing. So what I do is I price the housing using some government subsidy at no more than 20 to 25% needed for you to pay the mortgage out of your income every month. So it means that you can buy public housing and you will come out with no cash outlay every month, because using that 23%, it almost covers fully your mortgage payment. So that, in a nutshell, is the financial model.